If we understand this concept of the mission of God as kind of an overarching theological concept that frames then our thinking from there, we can move forward to talk about the idea of God as a missional God, the Bible as a missional book or missional story, the church as a missional people, and even our election as missional election or salvation. Now, we need to tease out what we mean by each of those, but first let me make a comment about this word missional, because I realize it has become something of a buzzword in evangelical circles over the last 10 or 15 years, almost to the point that it's become meaningless, because we sort of just use it in all kinds of different ways, but what do we mean by it? The word missional entered into the evangelical vernacular about 15 years ago. In 1999, a man named Daryl Guter was part of a group called the Gospel in Our Culture Network. And they together wrote a book. Guter was the editor of the book, and the book was called The Missional Church. And that book kind of introduced this term missional into the evangelical vernacular. And soon you had a whole bunch of other people that were using it and writing about it, talking about it. But the word actually has been around in the English language. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is kind of the gold standard of the English language, for over a century. And you can think about it this way. Mission is to missional as fiction is to fictional, right? It's simply an adjectival form of the noun mission, just as fictional is an adjective related to the word fiction. Mission is to missional as fiction is to fictional. Well, if we say that something is fictional, what are we saying? We're saying at its core, at its essence, this is a thing of fiction. So to call something missional, to use that adjective, is simply to say, at the core, at the essence of the thing, is the idea of mission. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about God being a missional God, about the Bible as being a missional story, a missional book, about the church as being essentially a missional people, and even our election, our salvation as missional. So let's talk about what we mean by each of those. First, the idea of God as a missional God. David Bosch, the missiologist from South Africa, wrote a kind of a paradigm-shifting book in the late 1980s called Transforming Mission. And here's what Bosch says. He says, mission is understood as being derived from the very nature of God. It is thus put in the context of the doctrine of the Trinity, not of ecclesiology or soteriology. The classical doctrine of the Missio Dei as God the Father sending the Son and God the Son sending the Spirit is expanded to include yet another movement, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit sending the church into the world. What's Bosch saying? Well, if you understand the way kind of theology is talked about, written about, studied, there are different foci, different areas of focus within theology, the various ologies that you have to take classes on around here. And that starts with theology proper, the theology of God himself. And then eventually it moves on to talk about anthropology, about human beings, about soteriology, about salvation, and then eventually about ecclesiology, our theology of the church. And what Bosch here is saying is that oftentimes we get around to talking about mission when we get down here, to talk about salvation or to talk about the church, soteriology or ecclesiology. But what Bosch is suggesting is we ought to start talking about mission from the very beginning, within our theology proper, as we talk about God himself and his character. That part of what it means to talk about who God is to recognize that the Christian God is the sent and sending God. God the Father sends the Son. I think there's over 40 times in John's Gospel that Jesus is described as sent. Jesus returns to the Father, and the Spirit is sent to indwell and empower God's people. And then Father, Son, and Spirit send the church into the world. Jesus says to his disciples in the upper room, John chapter 20, after his resurrection, he says to them, as the Father sent me, so I send you. The Christian God is the sent and sending God. You can sort of think about it this way. If you want to know what God is like, where do you look? What is the ultimate expression of the revelation of God? The incarnation of Jesus. Right? Jesus himself is the greatest revelation of God. What's Jesus like? He's a lot like a missionary, isn't he? Who's left his home to come and bring a message of hope and salvation, to bring the message of the reign of God. The Christian God is the sent and sending God. That mission is at the core of who God is and how God engages with the world. We talk about mission in our theology proper, our understanding of who God is. Second, missional Bible. Not only do we talk about God as a missional God, but we talk about the Bible as a missional story or a missional book. This quotation comes from Christopher Wright in his book that's called The Mission of God. And he says this: "The writings that now comprise our Bible are themselves the product of and witness to the ultimate mission of God. The Bible renders to us the story of God's mission through God's people in their engagement with God's world for the sake of the whole of God's creation." Right? So far what he said is the idea that the Bible actually emerges as the product. It comes out of this idea of the divine mission, but it also is the witness to it. It points back and tells us the story of the divine mission. He goes on and says, "The Bible is the drama of this God of purpose engaged in the mission of achieving that purpose universally, embracing past, present, and future, Israel and the nations, life, the universe, and everything, with its center, focus, climax, and completion in Jesus Christ." And then here's the punchline. Mission is not just one of a list of things that the Bible happens to talk about, only a bit more urgently than some. Mission is, in that much abused phrase, what it's all about. The Bible doesn't just happen to talk about mission. The mission of God is what the whole thing is about. I grew up in Sunday school. I grew up learning the stories of the Bible. It wasn't until I came to Dallas Seminary that I learned that these stories were held together by more than merely the leather cover that bound them, right? It wasn't until I came to Dallas Seminary that I learned that the stories of the Bible are held together by a singular story. That the Bible is, in essence, one large narrative. The story of God's mission to rescue and renew his good but broken creation. The mission of God is what the Bible is all about.